Welcome to this edition of the Talk of Simsbury. My name is Dominique Avery. Today we're going to preview the 2017 legislative session, which officially starts on January 4th. Joining me for this discussion is State Senator Kevin Witkos, as he did last year. Democratic State Representative John Hampton was supposed to be here, but he suddenly got sick. I've left a chair for him because we want to remind you that he was supposed to be here. John and Senator Witkos both won re-election in November, Witkos to his 5th Senate term and John Hampton to his 3rd House term. Also back with us today is Hartford Courant State Capitol Bureau Chief Chris Keating. He happens to be a Simsbury resident, and we're delighted that he comes to share his expertise with all of us. I'm so glad to have you both here today.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, right? As the result of the November election and many retirements, and there are a lot of major changes at the state capitol. Lots of new legislators, changes in House legislative leadership, and a new balance of power in the Senate. Chris, I'm going to start with you. I can't ever remember so much change. Can you just sort of give us a quick overview, and then we can sort of get into the details with Kevin?
Yeah, well, this is very big. There's an 1818 tie in the Senate, which will be the first time in almost 125 years. So this is very unusual. It's the best year for the Republicans in at least 20 years. 20 years ago, some of your viewers will remember, Rowland was governor, and the Republicans did have the Senate. Jim Fleming from Simsbury was the majority leader. So that was in the years, that was after the 1994 election. So 95 and 96, the Republicans had control. Since then, it's been the Democrats. So this 1818 tie, which we'll talk about today, there's a lot of nuances to that, and a lot of intrigue, I guess, as to exactly how that will work. In the House, it's 79-72, which is also the closest in probably about 50 years. Same thing with that. The last time the Republicans had that was when Reagan won in 84. So in 85 and 86, the Republicans had control, but it wasn't as close as this 79-72 that we're talking about. So the 79-72, from my research, is literally like the closest since like 1959. So it's really quite a year. Only 4 votes would switch 79 down to 75, and now you're on the losing end at 75. So there's a lot to look forward to. 2017 will be very interesting, very hard to predict. I'm sure people are going to be making predictions, but I think it's a little hard because we might see some unusual coalitions, and nothing is guaranteed. I think in the old days, Marty Looney, who was the Senate leader on the Democratic side, could tell the House, don't worry about it, we have the votes, don't worry, we can do a bill X. And even though we didn't vote yet, we'll handle it for you. This year, I think that would be a little bit harder to guarantee on any number of issues, and we can talk about them as we go forward. We're definitely going to get you a 3rd casino or whatever the issue is. Quite difficult.
I ran into John last week, and he just came from a caucus, and at that point, that was the Christmas week, he said there were no chairs of committees, they didn't even know how many committees there were going to be, and the House was feeling very nervous because of the small margin in the Democrats, and also because of the Senate with a tie. The Senate would determine everything that was going to come down to the House. So that was what they were talking about. In any case, this is all inside baseball stuff at the legislature, but I think it's fascinating. And Kevin, you are sort of right there on the ground floor. You are now in a very powerful position, right?
Well, if you look at it from the outside looking in, you wouldn't think there's much happening in the building because a lot of the things that are happening behind the scenes. And you mentioned it quickly, Dominique, about committee assignments. Those won't happen until after the first day of of us being sworn in
Which is
January
unusual.
4th.
Which is
because especially in the House, there's only 4 votes that sway either side. And there's this concern or pause, I'll say, that there could be a coup attempt by somebody else rising up, joining with the Republicans and a small number of Democrats and choosing somebody else other than Joe Simwitz, who's thought to be the new
leadership
Speaker
fight.
of the House, a leadership fight. So that's why no committee chairs are being made or promised until after those picks are done on opening day.
Wow. All right. So,
And there'll be a flurry of activity from there.
Right. And I mentioned earlier, I went down to the state capitol last week to take some photographs for the beginning of the show. And if people sort of watched the open of the show, they saw everything at the Legislative Office building. There was nobody there. Nobody there. Now, that's quite unusual. It was, the week before Christmas, but it's still unusual that there was nobody working for session when session begins next week.
Usually we have folks called sessionals that only work when the legislature's in session because that's when we do all of our business. So we need additional staff. And this year, none have been hired. Usually they've already gone through the interview process. They've been hired. They would start on opening day, which is January 4th, 2017 for us this year. There's been no hiring date set yet. There's been no interviews conducted yet. So once we begin the process of opening day, which I think will just be purely pomp and circumstance, and we'll conclude with the governor's state of the state, then all this flurry of activity will occur Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, hiring massive amounts of folks on a part-time basis, if you will, committee assignments. Legislators new coming to the building don't have offices assigned to them yet, so they don't know where they're going to be. If committee assignments are changing, people are going to be scurrying about changing offices, so you're going to see movers moving boxes from one location to another, and it's going to be interesting. Very busy.
So now something else is changing. I don't know whether it changed yet, but when I was there last week, I still saw signs for Senate minority offices. Well, you're not minority anymore. So let's get into the discussion of what happened. Since you're now tied, 18-18, your titles have changed and the balance of power has changed. And I read that the Republicans threatened a lawsuit if there was no power sharing. Tell us the story. I mean, it really is quite fascinating. Maybe, I don't know, which one of you wants to tell us
and then
the
I
story?
could jump in to tell you why I think we are where we are.
Well, certainly Kevin can explain more in detail about the lawsuit, but yes, I was told that there was going to be a lawsuit. The other thing we should throw into the mix here was Marty Looney had a kidney transplant.
I know.
And he was one of the negotiators of this whole thing. And, kidney transplant is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, hopefully never. But so that was on a Tuesday when they were doing this, and they announced on a Thursday that there was this power-sharing agreement that Kevin can get into the details about. But, yeah, the Republicans had, I think, really not only threatened a lawsuit, apparently it was ready to go. I think Len Fasano had signed some papers or things of that nature. Make a long story short, I guess there won't be a lawsuit now. Because there's been an agreement. But yes, it potentially could things be a little bit awkward, I guess. This is uncharted territory. And again, nobody was around 125 years ago when this happened the last time. I think it was something, the Senate was like 24 people. It was like a 12-12 tire, something of that nature. It was totally different. So, yeah, the concept of having a Republican and Democratic chair, which Kevin can explain, within the same committee, my impression is that it will be easier to bottle things up. When the smoke clears on this whole process, and you could bottle up legislation, and if you bottle up so many things, then on June 7th, which is the ending day of the regular session, time could just run out on a whole bunch of things. So, if you continuously bottle things up, you bottle it up at the committee level, then it gets sent to another committee, you can bottle it up there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, with all that pressure and all that bills, and there's only so much time, that time could run out. I can't predict for you on what issue precisely, but that's probably a very quick synopsis.
All right, Kevin, so you were on the ground floor with this. Was there a lawsuit planned, and what was your thinking about we're equal now, we want equal power?
And I think part of it goes back to the reason why we're equal is the folks in Connecticut felt that the failed policies of the Democratic Party, supermajority, were bad for the state, and They're claiming we're in the Great Recession of 8 years, and all of the states, even though everyone in New England has recovered except for Connecticut. So we needed to change direction. I think the people wanted some type of a firewall. That's why oftentimes we had a Republican governor with a Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate, because there was a firewall, and we hadn't had that for the past 6 years. So this year, we, as you know, 18-18 split, and a couple of other candidates were less than a couple hundred votes down. So we said it's the will of the people that said we need to share power in the state Senate. And our lawsuit was based on research that the Democrats felt that Nancy Wyman would be the tiebreaker for all votes in the Senate chamber. However, Nancy Wyman does not take chair of the Senate until the officers of the Senate are picked. So what happens is Denise Merrill, who is our Secretary of State, opens up the Senate chamber, swears all the senators in, then a vote is taken for the President pro tem of the Senate and the majority leader of the Senate. And at that time, the President pro tem comes up, gives a speech, and then it gets turned over to the presiding officer, which would be Nancy Wyman. So she hadn't been in her chair yet, so that's where our thoughts was, don't go so fast thinking that you automatically are the majority because you've got an extra person in the chamber. And we felt very comfortable moving that lawsuit forward.
So let me just ask a sort of a little behind-the-scenes thing. Where did you meet at the Capitol? Did you meet in your offices there to have these discussions? Did you sit at a diner somewhere? How did this happen?
Well, there were conversations going on.
Phone, email, right?
Well, combination. We had some staff involved as well, but a lot of it was based on Marty Looney and Len Fasano's long-term friendship, and Len said that, we are 18 and you are 18. There's no supermajority, there's no majority, especially when most of the work is done in the committee process, which Nancy Wyman is not part of any committee process. So we said, all we want to do is share everything. Marty Looney can be the president pro tem. We understood he was going through his kidney transplant operation, and we would still vote for him to be the president pro tem, even if he couldn't be there on opening day, because we shouldn't hold somebody's health against them. And if his doctor's advice is to stay secluded for a few weeks, well, we wouldn't want him to be in any harm's way just for a vote for a leadership position. So that was part of our agreement with the power sharing agreement. So everything is basically split. We have a Democrat-Republican senator co-chair, a Democrat-Senate-Republican co-chair. We have to agree on the agendas. We have to agree on what bills that come out. When it's time to, at the end of the day, when we're actually voting on bills in the state capitol, it's called marking the calendar, which says this is our business that we're going to do today. We have a right to bring things up. They have a right to bring things up. And so it's truly going to be a lot of conversation.
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes and working together. Because otherwise, every bill will get shut down in the Senate. The only bills that will come to vote are House bills. And nobody wants that to happen. And that's not what we were elected to do. We were elected to do the job of the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, this whole story would, I think, make an absolute incredible episode on a television show about local legislators, but nobody would believe that that Looney was having a kidney transplant in the middle of all of this, and Len Fasano and Martin Looney have been friends for years, and so they were. I think it's fascinating. People behind the scenes don't know. I remember from watching that Marty Looney, he would bring out the bills that were going to be considered that day. Is he still going to do that? But he's going to have a list of things that you approve of. So he's still going to play that role?
Well, I think what we've agreed to was Bob Duff and I will sit down and we'll determine what we want to get done for that week, or however many days we're going to be in session over in the Capitol building. And then that list will go to Marty and Len, and they will sit down and determine what days and what bills on each day. So they'll fine-tune the list. So that's kind of what we've agreed to, that Bob Duff and I will make the master list, given what we think, how many hours that will be in, and then the two top leaders will determine what day and what order. We don't know. It's new.
If I could jump in on that.
Of course,
are you
please.
saying if no one agrees, like you could almost like block even having a session, in other words, because there would be nothing to debate? In other words, if you cannot agree, I'm not quite clear on that and exactly how that would work. Are you saying that a bill really won't be called on the Senate floor unless there's some kind of an agreement to call that bill? Is that
That's
kind of what you're saying?
That's how we plan on starting off. Yes.
Really? That's fascinating.
So we have a right to call. They may say,
Never been done.
so, right, this is historic, and we're making history this legislative session, that they may say, well, we don't agree to mark that as a go. And then there'll be a vote on that. So they would, if Nancy breaks the vote, then that bill won't be called, because we won't. But at least you have a vote to say we tried to mark it and it didn't happen. We could do the same thing and break that. So eventually stuff will get on the calendar to actually be debated, but it's the process of getting it there. And that was one of the concerns that we had from the Republican perspective. We wanted to vote on all union contracts. And that's one of the things that in our rules that we agreed to was that if there's an item that is tied to a specific time period, then Len can ask for a special session day, and then Marty has 20 days to pick, or 28 days to choose a day within that window. And then we'll have one.
Okay, tell us about that. Isn't there an agreement or a deal coming up, a union contract that I think the clock starts, correct me if I'm
on
wrong,
opening day.
30 days from opening day, is that correct?
Yes.
So how would that work? Are you saying you guys could kind of at least force a procedural vote? Take us through that. In other words, you could force a procedural vote. You might not win on the merits if Wyman beats you 1918. Am I correct on that?
So what would happen was we would say, we want to come in for a special session day to vote on this union contract. Then when the window is a 30-day window, so Marty Looney has 28 days to pick a day, and he and Len will agree on that day. Because of health concerns and stuff, we don't, as new to his operation, want to give him time to be able to make sure his health is there.
Yeah.
We would come in and we would go to mark the calendar and say, we want to vote on this item. And if the Democrats didn't want to vote on that item, they would reject the marking of the calendar, and there would be a vote on that. Basically, it's the same thing, up or down vote on the contract. And so if they say, no, we don't want to even debate it, we'll have a vote, that's 1818, then the Lieutenant Governor will break that vote. But I tend to think that that's not going to happen, because even the governor's come out and said that we should have an up and down vote on these union contracts.
So are you talking about a union contract coming up, or the adjustment in the pension?
Yeah, the pension adjustment related thing. Yes, which to me is union related.
Right.
Right. It might not be a union contract, meaning a lot of people in their head have a union contract. You got a 1% raise in the first year and a 2% in the second and third. Some of those will eventually be coming up too, correct?
Well, 16 union contracts expired last June, on June 30th. So they're operating under the existing contract until it's negotiated. So I think we will see those at some point during this session.
Yeah, at some level. And a lot of that is being negotiated behind the scenes, right. And we frankly don't really have all the details on the prison guards contract or whoever, who the DOT.
But in the past, I mean, in the past, if I recall correctly, a lot of these contracts have not been voted on. They've maybe come up before appropriations, but nobody's voted on them. They've just allowed them, if a certain number of days, they've just allowed them to take effect, right?
Yeah, once it hits the calendar, if it's not approved or voted on within 30 days, it's automatically approved. Right. And we saw for the first time, and I think this is what empowers the governor's message to say we should be voting on these, is when the University of Connecticut professors brought forward their contract through the Appropriations Committee. It passed they split the committee, which means the House members voted and then the Senate voted. The House passed it, the Senate did not pass it. So it came out of that committee with an unfavorable report from the Senate. Because of that, the university worked on talking to the union membership, and they pulled the contract. So it never actually came up for a full vote of the legislature, because the message was sent, it's too rich. You're getting 5% raises for 3 years in a row, and in this economy,
nobody
people
else
losing
is
their
getting
jobs. So I think it's important. And I think that this will add strength to the governor's argument, and quite frankly, in his negotiating tool. I don't think you'll see the contract settle until after his budget address, which will come out in February, because then you'll know what he's looking at for his savings and his
also
targets.
Specifically, one question on that UConn thing, is that still being negotiated behind the scenes? We haven't heard much about that.
I haven't heard anything. So
yeah, right. So in other words, it kind of disappeared, or they pulled it back, for lack of a better term, withdrew it from legislative consideration and said, hey, we're going to go back and renegotiate this. That was my understanding. But that has not come forward back again to the legislature, to my knowledge.
And that's what's so difficult sometimes in the state government. It's so big that there's so many different moving parts, and you only focus on the ones that seem to be appearing right in front of you, you're hearing about, and then they just kind of fade away, but they don't go away. They have price tags, and you got to be able to keep on top of those types of things.
Yeah. No, that's an example of the type of contracts and other points. Just one other question I had for you. In other words, if something went wrong, I don't know, there's a snowstorm or something like that, you're talking about this 28-day, 30-day period. And I know there's an agreement, I guess it's a verbal agreement, but what if something goes wrong and you guys thought there was going to be a vote within that 30-day period? We have a vote scheduled for a Wednesday, I'm making this up. There's this massive snowstorm, nobody can come in, et cetera, and time expires, then it would take effect? Or take us through that. That would not be what you wanted, but I'm not quite understanding, and again, it's a verbal agreement, and say we get to the 32nd day, what happens?
Well, we would hope that we wouldn't extend the session day, dragging it out to the 28th day, 25th day. And that was really a means to, say, for example, if Marty Looney had an infection and was in the hospital for a week and a half, it would give him time to recuperate and come back out. Or you can't determine sickness on individual members, but when somebody has a known procedure that they're just trying to recuperate from, you got to give them a little bit of leeway, and that's what we're trying to do. We would hope that we don't extend it out to the last week.
Right. And you're also saying you guys weren't trying to pull off any kind of coup or anything. As you said, on January 4th, if I heard you right, even if he was a little bit ill, you were going to vote for him as president pro tem. Right. You're not pulling some back room. No. We're going to pull a coup because this guy's ill, and because he is going to recover, as we know. And okay.
Can I ask you a quick question about Len Fasano, who is the leading Republican?
New Republican president.
We should bring Len here. We have an empty seat. Bring him on.
And Marty Looney, they're both New Haven legislators. Is that where their friendship comes from, or does it come from the Senate? I mean, it's interesting for the public to know things like this, I think.
Sure. I think they both have their own private law practices down in New Haven. I think that's where it came from. I don't know if Marty went to Yale or not. Len was a Yale graduate. So I don't know if they knew each other in their college years, but they've known each other for over 30 years.
So it's helpful to have...
They knew each other before they both got elected into the legislature. I mean, Marty has been there forever. He's only one of the few people in the Senate that understands what it was like to be in the minority party at one point.
Yeah.
And the other ones, unfortunately, power begets arrogance to some extent, and they've never had to really feel they had to work with the other side, because at the end of the day, you get what you want because the numbers were the numbers. But this time it's going to be a learning experience for everybody, including my own folks on the Republican side, that you've got to do a lot more homework, and you can be meeting with a lot more people, because the lobbyists and other special interests have been up there asking to meet with people, wanting to know who's going to be the chairman, chairwoman of the different committees so they can start working on their agendas. And they can't just meet with the majority party because we don't have a majority party in the Senate anymore. So they're going to have to meet with both sides, and they're going to really earn their money this
Everything.
I do want to add, as much as people do get along, and it is true, Fasano and Looney have personal friendships, et cetera, but as everyone knows, and Kevin knows, towards the end of the session, or maybe even before, there will frankly be issues that they just flat out disagree on. Absolutely. And there will be 18 to 18 votes. And Nancy Wyman will have to break certain ties, which maybe we can't predict as we're sitting here now, but I can guarantee you that will happen, because towards the end of the session, and again, even before, there's any number of party line votes, and sometimes people just frankly do not agree.
Let me just raise a question, though. Isn't there a Democratic legislator from Waterbury who very frequently votes with Republicans?
Yes, we could talk about that. There are some so-called conservative Democrats, Joan Hartley and Paul Doyle, sometimes Gail Schlossberg, yes, who don't want to vote for a tax increase or don't want to vote for a spending increase. Yeah, we really haven't gotten into that yet, but we can. So, yes, there may be an impression that there's 18 solid Democratic votes on every single issue. That's not the case. That is not the case. So
this is actually going to be a fascinating year. So we have been trying to figure out whether to do half an hour or an hour. And John Hampton was sick and he couldn't be here. But I think we're going to try and go a little bit longer. I'd like to take a break now to urge you to contribute to SCTV's capital fundraising campaign designed to upgrade and replace our aging equipment and to make us much more watchable for you. We're going to be back to talk about issues that are going to come up in the legislature after a break. Don't go away. Since 1984, SCTV has been the place to turn in Simsbury to watch local government in action. But we're more than local government and school meetings. SCTV is the only place where you can check out all the candidates in local elections. We have high school sports and exercise classes. Other shows keep you up on health, finance, poetry, music, and Simsbury hot topics. Now we need your help. Simsbury Community TV is embarking on a major capital fundraising campaign to bring SCTV into the 21st century. We've received a generous grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, but now we must match it. We want everyone to watch us on TV or on our website, but even if you never do, please help so that we can continue to keep your government open and you informed. Someday, when there's a crisis, you will want SCTV to be there.
Hi, my name is Lori Lubetkin. I'm co-owner of the Redstone Pub in Simsbury. I hope you'll join me in supporting SCTV. Since 1984, your connection to your town, your schools, and your government.
Well, we're back with our legislative preview, and Kevin Witkos, state senator, is here, and Chris Keating. If you're just joining us, we've been talking a lot about power sharing and the change in the number of legislators in the Senate and the House, but we haven't talked about any of the issues. So maybe we should talk about issues that are of concern to our viewers. So the budget's a big issue. We've talked a little bit about that. Bail reform, marijuana, all kinds of things. What you start, Chris? What?
Well, I think we could talk about a whole number of things, and Kevin can get into it. Yes, the spending cap, the budget very often is kind of in almost any session, kind of an overriding factor, and by that I mean once the budget outlines come in February of what the governor says, it kind of within a certain range kind of says what's possible and what's not possible. I mean, no one's really talking about tax cuts. But the governor does not always get what he wants in the budget, but there's a kind of an adage at the Capitol. People think maybe about 75%. The governor sets the framework, at least, put it that way, and discusses and brings out what's possible. Also, we have tolls potentially. The governor has wanted a very large transportation program that everybody kind of agrees with in theory. Let's upgrade our roads. Let's improve everything. The so-called Etna Viaduct in Hartford. John Larson wants to build tunnels for $10 billion. There's all kinds of stuff, all right? I mean, imagine if we were tunneling, all right, and Larson was talking about 2 tunnels. In other words, an 84 tunnel and a 91 tunnel going north. That's a lot of tunnels, and tunnels are expensive, as you know. And the governor and the state DOT was kind of saying, these tunnels are too expensive. But I think at the same time, Malloy basically said, look, if the federal government, if you get the money, you can do your tunnel. But I think he kind of also was saying in the same breath, we don't really have the money to do this, at the state level. So if you can convince people in Congress, now you got Trump involved. So I don't really know how much of that will happen. But we could talk about tolls and spending cap. These are all fiscal and money-related things tying in with the budget. I should just mention the one number, the projected deficit, and it changes as your viewers know. In round numbers, 1.4 billion projected deficit. Could that change? Of course. And with the money coming in the door, I did read one thing that Christmas was not as gangbusters as some people thought it was going to be. You can debate that. There's a lot of people in the stores, but if everything's 50% off, there's not as much money comes in the door. So Christmas.
So we're talking about the sales tax
the
receipts.
sales tax receipts, which is the second biggest. The income tax is the biggest. Sales tax is the second biggest amount coming in, so it's very important. And the third biggest amount is federal grants. So income tax, sales tax, and federal grants, as far as bringing the money in the door that we need. There's a whole bundle of other taxes, as you know, but those are the three largest amounts.
So you mentioned tolls, and Connecticut has been debating tolls for years, and Massachusetts now just went to a system with transponders, and there are no more toll keepers. You can drive right through. What is the objection in Connecticut?
I think people look at tolls as another form of taxation to the residents of the state. Not only just going about your daily business, but going to and from work potentially. We have some of the highest gas tax hikes in the nation, and if we don't see a correlating reduction in that, why should people pay the toll?
Well, it gets people from out of state.
Well, some, but you're still getting the folks in state too. And the other thing is, it's just another source of revenue to be gobbled up by the state government. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be used in the Special Transportation Fund, which was designed for. So that's why there was a lot of conversation about the transportation lockbox last year, that people don't mind funding something if they know what the money is going to be used for, and it only goes for that usage.
But that didn't go anywhere.
No, because there was a huge loophole in that piece of legislation. We pointed it out. It passed, I think, unanimously, or maybe by one vote negative in the Senate, but the House didn't pass it because of the loophole. And the loophole was that once the money got into the lockbox, then it would be secured. But it has to go through a couple channels to get there. So there could have been a detour, which could have been a sweep, as we know, and used for something else. And that's what the folks in the House had some concerns with that.
So what do you think is going to happen this year?
Well, any legislator that abuts 95 knows transportation is their biggest key issue. Not so big in my neck of the woods and John's neck of the woods, because we don't really have that much public transportation other than our own public roads. But those folks are zeroing in on the need for infusion of dollars for the rail systems. They're making the deep ports, trying to make some deep ports to increase commercialization down on our ports, and traffic congestion along I-95. So I think if they felt that they could be secured in the fact that the money goes and stays and only used for that, I think you could probably do it.
That would pass?
We put together a plan, Prioritize Progress, on the Republican side last year, which would have invested $70 billion in our transportation funding area without additional tax increases. And so we have a plan out there. Love to have the governor take another look at it with Commissioner Rediker, or even our moderate Democrat friends. Or let's work together to come up with something and make sure that the money that is raised for that stays with that.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, we don't even know who the chairs of the committees are going to be. It's all up in the air. And of course, this is going to air all through the month of January, and a lot of these issues will have been worked out. But any viewer who watches this will have gotten an inside look on what's going on behind the scenes, I think, because of Kevin and you both have such tremendous expertise here. I'm really excited to have you here. So something else that I noticed that at least one representative has introduced is something early voting. And Connecticut sees itself as a sort of a very democratic state with good voting procedures, et cetera. But we have not had early voting.
Nor should we.
Well, that's what I'm going to ask. I think Tong has introduced already a bill for early voting, and you're opposed to it.
Absolutely opposed. And 2 years ago, the Secretary of State had put forward a constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to change our voting laws. And I was, I think, the only Republican senator that voted for that. And I said, all we're doing is asking the people, putting the power back to people, say, do you want us in the legislature to have the ability to do that? And it was a resounding no. They defeated that. They said, don't tinker with our election laws. We're not going to give the legislature the right to do that. So that's the message to me. Don't mess with it. So I will never support that.
Chris?
Yeah, that was a, if I recall correctly, right, that was a ballot question, and it's very rare that a ballot question goes down.
So-
Yeah, I don't want to say that people don't really even read the ballot question, but sometimes these ballot questions, excuse me, charter reforms and all these other things are very, very complicated. And in my experience, a huge percentage of ballot questions are approved, unless there's some kind of understanding that it's not a good idea, and apparently that one didn't go anywhere. But anyway, early voting, a lot of other states have it. That is true. Connecticut is the land of steady habits.
Steady habits.
Maybe they start voting early in Florida and other places. The only form, I guess, we have of early voting is, if you get an absentee ballot and you're away at college and you actually voted on October 15th or something like that, but no mass early voting like we've seen in other states. And it's just not done that way in Connecticut. And people know November 8th is election day, or whatever day that particular one is, November 8th this year. Basically, you better be there on November 8th. And if you care enough, make sure you vote on that date.
Yeah, I'm actually very conservative on that issue, too. I also feel like in Connecticut, in a state where you can actually reach the voting booths very easily because we're such a small state, maybe it's different in Oklahoma or some of the Nevada spread out states where it's a long ride to vote, I could see maybe. But here, voting is a special thing. I think it should be done.
Here in Simsbury, you have 4
I know.
different polling
It's-
locations.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
I mean, that's one town. So
I agree.
you don't have to travel too far from your home to get to a polling location.
But
Right,
there-
the huge number of polling places in Connecticut. On opening election day, maybe we all take it for granted, but there's a tremendous number of polling places.
Right.
Not that you can go to any one; you have to go to your own,
Right.
obviously. But they're
right.
all over the place.
It's not difficult to vote here. No, I agree.
No, right.
So I think the governor is also going to pursue, he's been trying to get bail reform in. That's been happening since I was covering the legislature. Does that have any prayer this year?
Well, it depends on how he wants to, craft the legislation. Last year, there was folks that were convicted of felony charges that he wanted to just kind of dismiss out, and we said, no, you can't. These types of individuals should not have access to a second chance, or get out of jail free, if you will. I just don't see that happening unless it's a good, well-written piece of legislation. I don't even know that we really have a problem with the bail reform in our state. I just don't sense that there's people don't have access to bail. I agree some of these smaller charges, we shouldn't be putting cash bonds on folks, but the judges can handle that. We don't need a law that says that. Put it through their practice book that says if you're doing traffic violations or something, unless you have a history of not failure to appear, then you don't. It's a non-surety bond and get out.
I can't. My memory, I've watched a lot of hearings on this, and I do remember some awful stories about people being caught in this, in the system and having to pay a lot of money and the bail bondsman system, and I don't know whether any of that's been addressed. I can't explain it adequately because I don't remember anymore. But
It's complicated. I think Kevin was on the ground floor of this. I believe 28 years as a police officer, so the average person, probably the average Simsbury viewer, fortunately or not, hasn't had to bail themselves out of prisons anytime, and hopefully haven't had to bail out their children. So I think a lot of people don't have experience with the bail system. But yeah, what Malloy's point was, and you can argue it all day, he was saying that, in other words, if somebody, say the bail is $10,000, his thought was that a poor person couldn't come up with it, and a rich person could for the exact same crime. Maybe that's oversimplified, but that's what he was saying. But what Kevin was saying was that people who had done fairly serious things, that maybe you don't really want them out, at least not immediately. Don't want to snap your fingers and let them out. Let it get in front of a judge. Let the judge say, and then obviously there's a big argument there with the bail commissioners, the prosecutors there. Everybody is there, and say Mr. Smith really is not a $10,000 bail person. He's a flight risk, and we don't think he should be released. Okay. And then the other side will come in and say that. So just one thing to add before we move on to another topic. There was a special session for this Second Chance Society, and nothing happened. This was back about 6 months ago, in other words. So the governor wanted to move forward with the second chance, and it wasn't just bail reform. There's other aspects of second chance. The bottom line is House didn't vote on anything because they didn't have the votes. They just didn't have the votes. And so we'll have to see what happens with the whole second chance. But I just wanted to add that they were specifically brought in to discuss this, to debate this. They said, we don't have the votes and we're going home. And that's what happened.
It's funny, a lot of it comes down to personalities too, and egos. And that's what's interesting is you're going to see that during this next legislative session is we're going to reduce the number of committees that we have. Right now we have 27 standing committees. And if we're looking at a $1.4 billion budget deficit, the legislative branch of government has to do its share of trimming and cutting where it can. And I think we can do that by folding some of these committees into themselves. So I think you're going to see a reduction. And that's what we're kind of debating right now on the leadership level is how many are we going to do and what's going to get folded into what.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what committees are going to get? What are you thinking?
Well, I personally am advocating for a Ways and Means Committee, combining the appropriations and finance together.
Appropriations
because
and
when you
finance.
do a budget in your house or any business, you look at your money coming in and the money going out. You don't do them individually or separately. And that's how we do it right now. That's the current practice in Hartford. The appropriations folks will figure out how much we're going to spend this year, and they bring it over to the finance department to make sure we have enough money to match our spending. And so either we have the money coming in or we have to raise taxes. And that's not the way to go about doing the budgeting. So I'm advocating that we combine the two. So you're looking at everything as a whole as you move through. And if I can't get that, the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee have subcommittees working on different things.
Right.
I want to have a combined subcommittee that will do just that, look at both parts of the budget when they build it. And so
Okay.
you have at least a set of eyes looking at the whole picture.
So that's interesting, Ways and Means, combining finance and appropriations.
And that would be quite a change.
Huge change.
The finance and appropriations goes way back even before the income tax. So it's been decades. The way we've been doing it lately, or the way we're doing it now, has been the system for decades. Doesn't mean it's the perfect system, but all I'm saying is that would be a change.
Yes, so we are still negotiating what committees we're going to. But at this point, I think we've agreed on a reduction of 3 committees, but I'd like to see more.
Would
And
you
it's not public
share
yet.
the 3?
No, it's
you
not
don't want to
public yet
share
because
them.
they want to have the leadership votes. Because some folks that want a specific committee, it may not be there anymore.
Right.
And so more in the House, they don't want
Right.
to put their cards on the table to know that, oh, I know you were always the chair of this committee, but guess what? That committee is no longer in existence. Can you vote for me for the speakership? No, I'm going to go for somebody else that's not going to do that. So that's kind of where we are right now.
All right, so I'm fascinated. I'm dying to find out what the committees are. School funding. We have this court case where I don't know how to say his name.
CJEF versus REL was the
Right. So McCowisher, is that how you say his name?
Mukasher, well,
I don't know how to say his name.
different ways.
Wasn't he in the legislature?
many years ago, and his
many
brother
years
was. I served
yeah.
with his brother.
So he wrote that the state of education was alarming, and he made all kinds of recommendations, and it's a huge issue right now. It's gone back to the Supreme Court, from what I understand. How is that going to come up in the legislature? Are you
Sure.
gonna deal with it? And I'm assuming the Education Committee will stay Education Committee. That's a pretty big deal.
Well, the Education Committee
Or maybe
operates a
higher
little
ed and
differently.
education together?
Maybe. How the current House chair runs that committee is it doesn't allow any individual bills to go forward.
Anti-flusher.
It's all committee bills. So everybody puts in their ideas, and then the committees will determine. They do their own bills. So a little different than how the other committees operate. But that's the ability of the chair to kind of direct your own committee. They'll be looking at it, and I know that the superintendent of schools were very upset and anxious when the decision was made this past fall. And we just said, listen, put the brakes on it. Nothing's going to happen until the legislature goes back into session, and we'll take a look at it. And let's look at what Judge McCowisher said. He said, we're putting enough money into education, but it's how it's divvied up and how it's dispersed and what it's utilized on, and all these other things, which I think went beyond his purview, but he just laid it all out. And so I think that's now the legislature needs to go back and start looking at some of those different things. And I think the governor's folks are looking at that as well. I read in the Hartford Courant some interesting article about education funding. I met privately with the governor's folks on education funding to the town. So I think you're going to see something like that mentioned in his State of the State address that it's been left off the table as far as cuts go for a number of years. The towns would say, well, our costs are increasing every year. You've been flatlining us, so we haven't received the same money. So we are, in essence, taking a cut. It's two different ways of looking at it, as a glass half full or half empty. And I think that's going to be a matter of discussion.
Well, it's going to be of very great interest to the people of Simsbury,
Right.
whether we get less money or the same, or, I mean, we are a relatively affluent town, and I guess the Board of Education is nervous, right?
Yeah, John Hampton was concerned about that. He's not here today, but he was concerned about that. Also, some of the Republicans, some of the legislators in the House and in the Senate thought that judge's decision was kind of a little bit far afield. In other words, that he basically made himself the education commissioner. He was the judge. He was about 5 different things. It was quite an expansive, as Kevin said, quite an expansive ruling. And he may have been correct on a whole bunch of these things, but people said that he didn't really have the authority. He's not the education commissioner. He's got a whole bundle of ideas, and he was trying to talk about the whole system, but they said it was a little bit beyond the purview of what the question was, of what the lawsuit was, which was about the funding. He was talking about teacher evaluations and all kinds of
And
things.
special education. And
Yeah,
that was,
things that really weren't litigated or really at issue. So he used it as an opportunity to talk about the entire education system, which is obviously very important. But in the legal world, you have to focus on what the lawsuit was about generally. Just because you're doing an armed robbery case, the judge can't say, I'm against the death penalty and bring that in. Obviously, that wasn't exactly the case here, but some people thought that he went beyond the scope of what the lawsuit was about.
So for people on the Board of Education who are watching this, and officials, tell me sort of step by step what you think is going to happen having to do with education funding. Just review it again.
Sure. Well, I think that's a third of our budget at the state, and so we spend billions of dollars on education every year, and we're required to. It's a constitutional mandate that we have to provide a quality free education to all of our students. And so I think that we'll be looking at the cost of special education. I met with some folks during the interim between the election and January 4th about how to fund special education. So it's not a surprise. That's one of the biggest things that most towns have a problem with is a family could move in that has a high special needs student, and it could wipe out a special education budget. This new model will provide towns basically like a stop loss, if you will, like an insurance policy that everybody could buy into and create a pool. And I think
I mean, a state pool.
state pool for special education costs. And we're looking at that, and I'm very intrigued by that. I need to see the white paper that should be coming out very soon. I think that's the direction that the state should embrace and go into. I think that if we're going to reduce funding at the state level to the towns, that we also have to reduce the MBR percentage accordingly. MBR is a minimum budget requirement. So right now the law says whatever you spent in education this year, you have to spend next year. You cannot reduce it. There's a provision if you lose X amount of students, then you can reduce it a proportion, but it doesn't really correlate dollar for dollar. So if the state has to cut 5% spending in education aid, then the town should be allowed to reduce their budgets by 5%, if the town wants to. And that's really up to the towns. Two of the towns that I represent 11 communities, their boards of education wanted to close 2 schools. And the towns, people said no, and in fact, one of them was in New Hartford. They had a non-binding referendum, and it was voted 3-1 to keep the school open. So yet, they might have been able to save some money by closing one of the schools, but the townspeople said, no, we'll pay the additional taxes to keep that school open. So I think sometimes if we give the choices back to the locals, I think it's better rather than the state pushing things down.
Well,
But I think, look, we're at a $1.4 billion projected budget deficit. Everything's going to be on the table, and including municipal aid. I think that's going to be the one thing that's targeted. People can claim it's a cost shift. You're going to force us. Well, no, maybe you have to just reduce the number of services that you offer now too. Just like the state's, the other third of ours is the state employee costs, healthcare and pension. We've got to do something on that front. That just can't not be held in isolation without them coming to the table and helping out.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the state employee contracts and how they're going to be dealt with this year. Do you think that it's in the cards to reduce, to say no to the contracts, and where the state employees will be forced to take less or contribute more to their
Well,
pensions?
with the
or-
contracts, sometimes even if those contracts are rejected, sometimes they get kicked back or they go to arbitration. It's a little more complicated. In other words, even if a contract is rejected, it's not just an immediate snap your fingers and nobody gets any raises or anything like that. So these things are ongoing. It's been a long time since any contracts were rejected. I think maybe 1993 or 1994. I was covering it when some contracts were rejected, and they were really only rejected because some conservative Democrats came over to also reject specific contracts. And as you can imagine, the unions didn't like that. So you're basically talking 2 decades ago since they've rejected any contract, at least in my memory. But it has happened. It's not that it's never happened. It has happened, and usually those were very difficult fights in the Senate to do that. So, but again, the workers don't go away. So again, they would come back and renegotiate. As Kevin was saying on that Yukon contract, they pulled it back. In other words, I think there was a fear that if there was a vote, it was going to get voted down. So at the last minute, there never was a vote. They pulled it back and they said, we're withdrawing this. So could things like that happen? Sure. I think it would depend what the atmosphere is going forward. Yes.
But I think, Chris, you guys reported that Marty Looney, the President Pro Tem of the Senate on the Democrat side, said that he agrees we should do something to prohibit spiking of pensions. And that spiking of pensions is, right now, is based on your highest 3 years, which are usually your last 3 years.
And
so
overtime,
everybody
right?
works a ton of overtime to bump it up. So if you were making $80,000 a year in base salary, people's pensions were $110,000 because they'd work numerous hours their last 3 years to bump up their numbers, and then that would be averaged over those 3 years, and they get to retire at that. So I think
you guys support, the Republicans definitely support eliminating overtime as counting toward the pension.
Yes.
I read that, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and John
That
Lender
makes
wrote a
sense to
story
me.
in the Courant. There was a person, I believe a police sergeant, got something like $180,000 in 1 year in overtime. Not their salary, that was the overtime amount, which you probably have to work 80 hours a week to do that. But anyway, $180,000 a year in overtime, that's quite a bit. Plus what your salary was.
Right.
Granted, that was the highest, and I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but some people do make large amounts of overtime. That is true. Not everyone, but
But
some
we have to
people.
start looking at different things of, and it's not the state employees' faults. I mean, I got to be honestly with you. They accepted their jobs based on, and this was the benefit package that they got, so good for them. But now we've got to get with the modern times almost. We have folks that are either paying 0 towards their retirement or 2%. Nobody, I was a police officer for 28 years. When I left the Keating Police Department, I was paying 7% towards my pension. And I think most people, I think 6% is what you should pay. State employees pay 0 or 2%. So the amount of savings that we could get, and it's for their own retirement. That's what gets me there, saying, we don't want to do this. Well, you're only getting your own money back, and you're just softening the blow of the taxpayer who's going to fund you for your service for all the years that you put in.
And in the private sector, and especially in nonprofits, at CTN, we had no pension.
Well, most towns, like everybody in Simsbury now is on a 401k. I mean,
Exactly.
most municipalities, all the police officers and town hall workers and DPW workers, they're on a 401k type plan now.
Yeah, and a lot in the private sector, as you know, a lot of pensions have been frozen, et
Right.
cetera. There's, not to go off on a tangent, but that's, for my money, that's part of the reason why Trump won, was people, there's been a buildup of people, their pension was frozen, their pay was frozen. This has been going on for years and years and years. The Trump phenomenon didn't happen in 5 months and he wins. So that's a tangent, but all I'm saying is people, your viewers, anybody who does anything understands what has happened over the last 10, 12, 15 years with frozen pensions, small wage increases, et cetera. So that's just a small tangent from me.
Can I ask a question about, now that you mentioned Trump, the increase in the number of Republicans in the legislature and in the Senate? You attributed that to, people here, finally deciding they didn't like the Democrats having all the power. Do you think that there was a Trump effect here?
I think in Eastern Connecticut, there was. But also down in the Fairfield County folks that had never voted for a Democrat president before for umpteen years, they voted for Clinton. So I think that there was a Trump effect, either positive or negative, depending on where you lived in the state. And I think that Donald Trump helped our candidates out in the eastern part of the state.
Now, I have a question about politics, about gubernatorial politics. So it looks like Malloy is not going to run again. Have you heard anything? Do you know?
Well, you never know. You never know with Malloy. You really don't. I wrote a story about it. There are some Democrats that think that he should or he could. It's 2 years away. I wouldn't rule it out. I'm not saying he definitely would run. I'm not saying he definitely would win. But Malloy enjoys being governor. You have to keep that in mind. He enjoys being governor, and he's won 2 times. And there's a thinking among Democrats that I've talked to, if he thinks he can win in any way, that he would run. Could it be a long way away? Yes. The one thing to keep in mind, it's 2 years away. And how many people thought 2 years ago that Donald Trump would be president of the United States?
That's true.
So 2 years can be a very long time.
So are there other Democratic candidates who are chomping at the bit to run? Kevin Lembo?
Lembo, some people put Nancy Wyman in that category, Ted Kennedy Jr. People throw names around, but I think Malloy, it's Malloy's to lose. It's Malloy's to, in other words, if Malloy wanted to run, I don't know. Some people think he might be primaried. And the overlay of all this, he's at 24% in the approval ratings.
Right.
The Republican says he's really at 18 due to some other polls. But the Quinnipiac poll had him at 24%. Normally, somebody at 18% does not try to run for re-election. But again, can things change? Yes. The winds can change quickly. Again, who thought Trump was going to win? If you looked at the polls a long time ago, some people thought Jeb Bush was going to win. Right. All right, so a lot of things can happen in politics. People said Jeb Bush, he's got the most money, he's got $100 million. Trump isn't going to make it. It's hard to tell.
So would you believe we're almost done with our hour? Right. Any last words before I have to wrap up?
Well, it's gonna be an interesting year. Stay tuned. Watch what you can on SCTV and tune into CTN and watch the people do the business.
So thank you.
It will
Strap
be
in and hold on.
interesting.
Yeah.
It will be interesting, no question.
So I want to thank everyone here at SCTV for getting the show on the air, but thanks especially to my guests, Kevin Witkos and Chris Keating. And I'm so sorry that John Hampton was sick, but you two have such expertise. You're the second highest ranking Republican in the state Senate now. You're the state Capitol Bureau Chief. And I think this was a very, very interesting discussion. If you missed any portion of this show, you can always find it on our website at simsburytv.org. Just a reminder, Kevin just mentioned it, you can access tons of information about the General Assembly at cga.ct.gov. And you can find Chris Keating's great reporting on the Hartford Courant, both in the newspaper and on the website. And you should not forget about Connecticut Government Television, CTN, where you can actually watch committee meetings and learn about the new committees that have been established. And you can watch House and Senate sessions. And they have a very helpful week in review program called Capitol Report, which airs every single weekend. I'm Dominique Avery. See you next time for the Talk of Simsbury.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.